Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
In episode 86, the Revolution to Rights series moves from the American Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement. In this podcast, Michonne and I talk with Reverend Dr. Gordon D. Gibson about the 2014 film Selma, directed by Ava DuVernay, and the 1965 voting rights movement that culminated in the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, led by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Reverend Gibson was among the clergy who answered Dr. King's call in 1965 to join civil rights activists in Selma, working for justice in the hostile landscape of the segregated South. Today, Reverend Gibson leads in-person pilgrimages of Selma and other poignant landmarks of the civil rights movement with living witnesses for the Living Legacy Project. We'll tell you more about Reverend Gibson and the Living Legacy Project later in this podcast.
The demand for voting rights in the United States was a long and dangerous effort by individuals starting from the ratification of the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction in 1870, which states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Black and some poor white voters in the South were subject to poll taxes or pay to vote, keeping these citizens from exercising their constitutional right to vote in state and federal elections. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, abolished poll taxes. Yet the same Southern states where racial segregation was legal found other ways to keep primarily Black voters from voting, including impossible literacy tests, threats of imprisonment, and acts of violence for registering, attempting to register, or to cast a vote.
In 1965, Selma, Alabama would become ground zero for activists to advance nonviolent protest for voting rights for African Americans. The Selma Voting Rights Campaign was not about voting as an end in itself, but the understanding that the right to choose elected leaders who make decisions that govern everyday lives are an exercise of power. The evidence of voting as power is shown in the attempts by state legislatures, the executive branch, and even some Supreme Court decisions to erode voting rights legislation, gerrymander voting districts, and suppress voter participation through ID requirements, closing voting locations, and undermining voter confidence in elections. Nearly a month before John Lewis and Hosea Williams would lead the march in Selma known as Bloody Sunday, James Orange, a Southern Christian Leadership Conference field secretary, was arrested in Marion, Alabama for organizing young people to support a voter registration drive. Local residents came together to march in protest of Orange's arrest. They were met by a blockade of state troopers who dispersed and chased the marchers. Some sought refuge in a cafe, including Jimmy Lee Jackson. State troopers stormed into the cafe and shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, who later died from his wounds. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death gave impetus to the marches that followed in Selma, Alabama. Organizers, including activist women Diane Nash, Annie Lee Cooper, and Amelia Boynton Robinson, planned the marches and gained the support of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Over 5,000 people marched across Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge to the State House in Montgomery, Alabama. They were met by 25,000 in Montgomery to deliver a petition to Governor George Wallace demanding voting rights and free and fair elections.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The Voting Rights Act was designed to remove legal barriers at the state and local level and enforce the right to vote as stated in the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These stories of the historic struggle for voting rights and the actions of everyday people in Selma following Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership in 1965 are told in the 2014 film Selma. Selma reveals how the demand for voting rights became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, and also the determination and persistence required to ensure that all people can use the power of the ballot.
Selma is directed by Ava DuVernay and features David Oyelowo as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Carmen Ejogo as Coretta Scott King, Coleman Domingo as Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Andre Howard as Andrew Young, Tom Wilkinson as President Lyndon B. Johnson, Oprah Winfrey as Annie Lee Cooper, Tessa Thompson as Diane Nash, Lorraine Toussaint as Amelia Boynton Robinson, Ruben Santiago Hudson as Bayard Rustin, Omar G. Dorsey as James Orange, Wendell Pierce as Reverend Hosea Williams, Stephen James as John Lewis, Lakeith Stanfield as Jimmy Lee Jackson, Common as James Bevel, and others.
We begin our conversation with Reverend Dr. Gordon D. Gibson. Reverend Gibson was ordained as a Unitarian Universalist minister in January of 1965, and in the course of his career served congregations in Massachusetts, Mississippi, and Indiana. During a break from full-time parish ministry, he was an investigator for the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's Mississippi office for 7 years. In February of 1965, Gordon and a colleague were asked by the Unitarian Universalist Association to go to Selma, Alabama to see what role Unitarian Universalists might have in the voting rights work Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had started in Selma. In the course of that visit, Gordon was charged with contempt of court for taking part in a demonstration and served 7 days of a 5-day sentence. Gordon is the author of Southern Witness, Unitarians and Universalists in the Civil Rights Era. He and his wife Judy received the Whitney Young Lifetime Achievement Award from the Knoxville Area Urban League. Welcome, Gordon, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Very good to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, Gordon, you are a minister in a faith called Unitarian Universalism, which is a liberal religious tradition that values reason and compassion. What motivated you as a young white Unitarian Universalist minister to join racial justice work and the civil rights movement in the American South in the 1960s?
It was, in significant part, religious, because we value the worth of every single individual. We strive for justice, and there is obvious injustice. Also a factor was family. I picked the right parents, people who valued justice and valued acting for justice. And there were some early experiences that fed into making me almost ready to do this. But and also civic education, which I think is undervalued today, played a role. Are we seeing what America should be? Obviously, 1950s, 1960s America, there was dramatic evidence that we were not seeing the America of our ideals.
And you've been engaged in this work, I think, throughout your ministry. Talk a little bit about the impact of those early experiences on your ministry over the decades.
Well, going to Selma was a marker in my life. There's life before Selma, before that brief immersion in the civil rights movement. And then there's everything since, because it really did change my outlook in significant ways. A few months after my experience in Selma, uh, my colleague in Jackson, Mississippi, Donald Thompson, was shot and critically injured, shot by the Ku Klux Klan. And my wife and I, at the time, August of 1965, were vacationing in Kentucky, visiting my parents. And my reaction was, "Oh, what can we do to support this colleague and the congregation?" And we wound up offering to go and spend, I think it was just a couple of weeks, in Jackson, Mississippi. Well, I wouldn't have thought of that before. Um, and then 4 years later, I wouldn't have accepted a call to follow a colleague who had been shot by the Ku Klux Klan. Just a very different frame of mind. Um, and a very clear sense that justice work is important and can't just be brushed off as, oh, if I have time. It's really central.
Mhm.
Ava DuVernay's 2014 film Selma focuses on the quest for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. And this may be just obvious, but why are voting rights important today? I mean, we have less than half of the people eligible to vote showing up at the polls. I think this is a question where we need some reminding about the importance of voting rights and even what were the goals in Selma around voting rights at that time.
As I understand it, Dr. King realized very clearly that the rights obtained up until 1965 were provisional. They could be taken away.
Mm.
Rights to vote were assured, then people would have the power of the ballot box to work for retention of their rights. I am very disappointed when people say, "Oh, no, I was busy," or, "Yeah, I didn't know. eh, I didn't know enough about the candidates. I didn't know who to vote for." That's sloth. That's being terminally lazy and unengaged. It's not really caring about your own future because you are uh, handing other people the power to make decisions about who will write the laws, who will enforce the laws. And it's important to mobilize people who have the vote to use that power. It's important to assure that we retain that power, that right to vote. And I know it's being whittled away bit by bit, uh, and we need to push back. We need to retain the right to elect those who will make decisions about our life situation.
When you come across someone who says, well, my vote doesn't matter, Or they'll say, "Well, I voted, but nothing in my life changes when I vote." What do you say to persons who respond that way when you say the vote is so important?
I've been doing some phone banking and door knocking and occasionally do encounter this. I point out we have races for office in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm now living, that wound up tied and were decided essentially by a coin flip. That's not how we should be choosing our leadership. We have situations in which 20% of the voters make a choice about who leads our community. It does make a difference if you know who to call to say, "I've been complaining about a pothole down at the corner. I need you to work to get that pothole filled because nobody else is doing it for me." And it helps, I find, to concentrate very locally. Somehow the big abstraction of, I will be voting for electors who will select the next president, that's pretty abstract. The person who determines whether my garbage gets picked up or not, that's important. And so let's build from the local base on up.
Yeah, and this time I think that's a really important reminder. We live in a city where we have very limited voting power. We have locally elected people. We don't have congressional representation, but certainly the school boards, we finally are able to elect our own attorney general, our mayor, our council, et cetera, are the people who, in terms of our everyday lives, have an impact.
Right.
So I was thinking about as I was rewatching Selma, while voting rights was kind of centered to that campaign, we hear people talking about more than just voting rights. They talk about education, they talk about jobs, they talk about, as you were saying, those things that have an impact at a very local level. Could you talk about the overarching goals of the civil rights movement as you were engaged in it at your time, and what kind of strategies were being used in order to advance those rights and those goals?
It was basically an exercise in being Americans. It was a mobilization of every citizen who could be reached to do what they were capable of doing to make their community better. And it recognized some people couldn't march down to the courthouse because they would lose their jobs.
Mm.
They might lose housing. It One of the dramatic moments fairly early in the Selma movement was when school teachers marched to the courthouse. These are people, respected members of the community, but people whose paychecks came from the government, the local government, people who would be very much at risk when the teachers risked, "Oh, well, maybe I could." And throughout the civil rights movement, it was a mobilization of people, an encouragement of every person to take his or her responsibility as far as it could be carried. It was exciting to feel the energy, the development of a deeper sense of community that was happening. And to see people investing themselves, local people volunteering, many of the civil rights workers were operating without a lot of support. As I understand it, the standard stipend for workers in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was $10 a week.
Mm. Wow.
Mm.
Even in 1965, that was not big dollars. And there were two stipends, two conditions. There had to be money in the SNCC treasury so they could pay it. And if you were in jail, well, you didn't need your stipend because you were being fed. So, somebody, typically a college graduate, working for $10 a week, unless they were in jail, it was clearly not a monetary motivator. So it was an exciting atmosphere to be in.
Now I know why I see those scenes of people being fed if they were only getting $10 a week. People cooking for them.
One of the amazing things in Selma was the local community coming forward, and when hundreds of people came to Selma, somehow they were fed by people who were not rich. Families in the housing project surrounding Brown Chapel took in these out-of-town people and fed them. These are people living on small incomes, marginal incomes, but saying, "Come on in. We have a bed. We'll feed you a breakfast."
I want to follow up on Taquina's question about that and what you've just said, because you all were really putting your lives on the line here. I mean, there's this fear factor that was legit. But it seems that by building a community, did that help kind of alleviate some people's fears and
Yes.
worries? I know the parents were very worried. You're not going to do anything about that.
Yes, the community stepping forward really was an important factor. And it is important to realize that in the civil rights movement, people were literally willing to put their lives on the line. Someone slightly older than me who was a bit of a mentor to me, Orloff Miller, who later had his own moment in the spotlight. He was walking next to Jim Reeb when Reeb was fatally injured. But Orloff, I think, realized maybe I wasn't taking going to Selma quite seriously enough. And he said to me, "Don't go to Selma unless it's more important that you go than that you come back."
Wow. What a statement.
We did draw up wills after that. And I think, so many stories from the movement about people, you know, realizing that, acting on that reality. While I was in Selma, I was in conversation with someone on Dr. King's staff. I think it was probably Andrew Young, who, in the course of the conversation with me, and I think there were one or two others, said of Dr. King, "We all know that 5 years from now, we won't have this man with us."
Mm. Mm.
If they were thinking this, Dr. King also had some sense that long survival was unlikely.
Wow.
Call, the call to do the work was irresistible.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
This podcast is part of our series Revolution to Rights, America at 250 for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. And you just brought up Dr. King, and, he always used our founding documents in his speeches and sermons. So let me remind all of us, in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." And the Constitution, which came in 1789, gave us the Bill of Rights, preceded by the preamble, "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. What did the Civil Rights Movement accomplish to make these founding principles a reality and not just words on paper or parchment? And what are the lessons that can be applied to movements for racial justice and economic justice in this century?
I think that the movement took seriously the ideals that were enunciated in those founding documents and very imperfectly enacted for all of the time since they were written. Clearly, not all people were treated as equally created. The Constitution had the 3/5 rule, which gave representation for each enslaved person, but no representation by those enslaved people. The movement insisted that those ideals could be realities. A few years ago at the Highlander Research and Education Center, one of the guest speakers for their annual homecoming was Robert Paris Moses, longtime SNCC leader, who gave a brilliant riff on that preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, not corporations, not money, we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, not just maintain a union, to form a more perfect union. And I think that was very much the spirit of the movement, to do that movement from aspiration to reality for those founding documents. Great language, very imperfect enactment.
Gordon, when you were talking about the outpouring of community in Selma and the way that people coming together gave power to what was being fought for, struggled for, etc. And it makes me think about some of the courage we've seen in Minneapolis. And specifically when you talked about the teachers coming out and other people thinking, oh, if they've come out and taken that risk, what can I risk? And I've been saying I think that courage inspires courage.
Yes.
What are you seeing in today's justice movements? Here we are in the 21st century that for you echo the spirit of the 1960s civil rights.
Well, I am reminded that the civil rights movement built on labor movement, early racial justice organizing. In the wake of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, almost every movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, they all drew veterans of the civil rights movement into roles, sometimes leadership, sometimes behind the scenes, coaching and wisdom sharing. So there is a continuity from, in some sense, a continuity from the revolutionary era. We must all hang together, or we most assuredly will all hang separately, through Reconstruction, the grasping freedom when it was finally made possible, through brilliance of the Harlem Renaissance, through labor organizing. It's a continuity across a long time, and we have to be adaptable. All right, this condition today is different in what ways? And it's hard for people today, looking back at the movement, to realize, oh, they didn't have cell phones. In 1964, in Mississippi's Freedom Summer, workers out in the field were told, call in by 4 o'clock so we know that you're safe. And there was a Watts line, a wide area telephone service set up in the Jackson central office. And people had coded ways to place collect calls to Jackson. Okay, Jody is calling in from Greenwood, and call back using the Watts line, so it was more affordable than a long-distance call. Long-distance call, that term doesn't make any sense anymore.
Right.
But so we've adapted. All right, today we have cell phones, but we need to learn, okay, if I'm arrested, my cell phone is taken, what can they glean from that cell phone? Okay, does that change what I do with my phone? it's a continuous matter of adaptation.
It's fascinating, too, that there was a dependence on the news media reporting and bringing those images into the living room. And now we get those images where? Through our phones and everyday citizens on the streets
Yes,
recording what's going on. It's
yes,
fascinating. That's that adaptability you were talking about.
yes, very much, very much. Yeah.
Well, this is something I've been feeling, Gordon, as I see attempts to erode and dismantle the progress that's been made with regard to voting rights, with regard to advances for uh, many people economically, socially, politically. And it's coming from our executive branch, it's coming from our courts, in some instances, it's coming from the legislatures.
Mhm.
Um, how does it make you feel to see so much of the work that's been accomplished being dismantled?
All over again. It, it's irritating, disappointing, aggravating, uh, and thinking, "Oh, we thought that was set. Well, back to work. What's another route to that same result?"
Mm,
And it takes some imagination. And one of the marvelous things about the movement was it could get very creative in how how you worked around courts that gave no credence to black witnesses, for example.
mhm.
How did you deal with officials who wouldn't wouldn't meet with you? And the story of the three civil rights workers disappearing in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Uh, the movement tried to tried to connect with the governor of Mississippi and confront him with what was going on, and always this. Then they noticed that there was an event at the governor's mansion, and one of the white workers, yeah, and Mrs. Schwerner dressed up in their Sunday best and went to this event. And the governor was out front shaking hands, and the white male civil rights worker took his hand to shake it and held on for dear life and introduced Mrs. Schwerner and had the conversation that they had never been able to have because the governor always ducked, didn't take their calls, refused comment. The conversation was had. So we have to be a little bit smart, a little bit clever, uh, maybe a lot clever.
Yeah, yeah.
And find another way around.
Yeah. I mean, Gordon, I'm going to take advantage of this time right now because one of the things that I've noticed or heard is that how people are now labeling compassion as a weakness, and that it's even
Mm.
coming out of, quote, "Christian," unquote, community. How do you
Yeah, empathy
respond?
is a sin now.
Empathy is a sin, compassion is out. How do you respond to that as a minister and as a veteran of the civil rights movement?
I I would gently, or maybe not terribly gently, suggest that people return to the basic documents of their faith. And I won't give the recitation for all the chapters and verses that they need to read, but they are certainly there. I think the Episcopal bishop, in her Inauguration Day comments, did a marvelous job of saying, I'm a Christian, this is what that means. And many others, fairly clearly in Minneapolis, religious institutions are doing an excellent job of talking about justice, of talking about compassion, of talking about empathy, so that we care for those who are related to us simply by a shared humanity. As one of the Senate hopefuls in Texas observed, there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. And I think this needs to be said repeatedly, clearly, with appropriate citations.
Well, historical dramas like Ava DuVernay's Selma often serve as gateways to history, particularly for young people.
Mhm.
However, firsthand accounts of those who were actors in the civil rights movement and the experience of place and rich understanding of history. You've been leading pilgrimages to civil rights sites with a program called the Living Legacy Project. Talk about the Living Legacy Project and its role in preserving and educating people about the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
I think one of the great mistakes of what I'd call the civil rights generation, people of about my age, a little older, a little younger, we didn't talk enough about what we had been through, what we had done, what we had attempted. There were generations who didn't learn about what had happened, except sort of it's very sketchy. Oh, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and I think there were some other people.
Yeah, yeah.
And fortunately, that's coming to an end. But I got involved in what's become the Living Legacy Project because the last congregation I served in Elkhart, Indiana, people said, you keep telling us these stories about the civil rights movement. When are you going to take us to see some of these places and people? So my wife and I figured out an itinerary, and we did what we thought was a one-time trip. No, oh, this was so good, you need to do it again. Well, 20 plus years later, we're still doing it. And what I found was it changed people to not just hear about Selma, Alabama, voting rights movement, Bloody Sunday, and so on, but to themselves walk across the Pettus Bridge, to hear people who just lost in the last months two people, two sisters who were on the bridge on Bloody Sunday and could speak vividly about it. But even less dramatic situations like that, to be on the spot and see the context and hear the stories is powerful teaching. And so we're trying to do that, continue to do that. I think we have probably the most affordable civil rights travel that there is. Others are also doing good work with it. We're not the only ones. And we're also putting on webinars because had to do this during COVID. You can't put people on a bus when you're supposed to stay 6 feet from each other. And we're continuing webinars because this is another way to bring the voices, to share the experiences of the movement. And it really can change people by giving some immediacy to that. Not just here, James Chaney, a citizen of Meridian, Mississippi, was killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. But to stand at his gravestone and realize it is held up by steel beams so that it cannot be tipped over again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful.
I want to give witness to that. I had an abbreviated experience of the Living Legacy Project in 2015, marching in the Arc of Justice. And there was nothing like actually bearing witness to the places where this history happened, being in Brown Chapel, being at the gravesite of those civil rights martyrs, and hearing those stories, being at the gym where many of the activists stayed. It really does help you understand how much people gave of their lives so that we can be here. And now it's our turn, I'd say. It's our turn.
It's up to us to carry that. Carry
Yes.
stories, that history, that energy forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, Gordon, if someone were to do a film or a treatment or retelling of the stories that you've witnessed or been a part of, or people you've met along your journey for, for a film like Selma or even a series, what untold story would you like to see?
I think of one from Marion, Alabama. Marion is a town even smaller than Selma, next county seat of the next county over. And it's where Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot by a state trooper. The march from Selma to Montgomery was spurred by that shooting and Jimmy Lee Jackson's death. And I remember Spencer Hogue speaking to one of our pilgrimage groups. I think it was maybe the very first pilgrimage we did in 2004. And some of his words really hit me a day later. He told many little stories and then said, during the movement years, my wife and I, every Friday night, we would go to that week's mass meeting at one of the two churches where we held those meetings. And before we left the house, get my oldest son, I'd put the important family papers up on the chest in our bedroom. And I'd tell our son, he was, I think, 12 at the time, now, if your mother and I don't come home tonight, you take these papers and the younger children to one of the grandmothers. The mass meetings were basically League of Women Voters educational sessions with much, much better music.
Mm.
But to be taking care that the children had an option if we did not come home. Wow. Today, we take going to a citizenship meeting very much for granted. That was not possible in the 1960s for Black Americans engaging in even the mildest participation in the movement. That's a story that I'd love to see told. And there are others.
It's more fertile ground
Yes,
for us to be inspired to plant the seeds.
yes.
The seeds are always there.
One other story that occurs to me. Actually, playing off the movie Selma, one of the plot elements that they injected into the story. It's a Hollywood version. It's not history. It's a Hollywood version. It needs plot twists and turns. Was to suggest a little bit of jealousy that Dr. King had, thinking Coretta found Malcolm X attractive.
Mm.
Um, I was present when Malcolm X spoke in Selma. Behind me, there are photographs of Malcolm speaking, and then Coretta speaking directly after him, and him listening thoughtfully and respectfully. And later photographs in that series show Malcolm and Coretta speaking. They were sitting on a pew behind the pulpit, and Fred Shuttlesworth of Birmingham was speaking, and they were having a whispered conversation. And then Shuttlesworth must have said something incredible, which he was very capable of, and Malcolm leaned back and smiled, the smile sort of saying, "I can't believe I heard what I just heard." Yeah, I think this whole jealousy thing was a figment of the screenwriting.
Creative choice.
Yes. But two things did happen that couldn't have been on the screen in that movie. One was, I heard from someone who was working on a documentary about the last days of Malcolm, that the New York Police Department recorded a telephone conversation between Malcolm and Martin in the 2.5 weeks after Selma that Malcolm lived.
Mm.
Conversation in which they agreed, oh, yes, we differ on some things. We need to work together. We need to blend our efforts. Malcolm had already asked SNCC workers if they would work with him if he brought his movement south. And they had said yes. So there was something else going on there that had nothing to do with romance. Later, 3 women got together, developed a friendship, a mutual support system. Myrlie Evers, widowed in 1963. Betty Shabazz, widowed in 1965. Coretta Scott King, widowed in 1968. They went on retreat together. They were a mutual support system. That's not widely known, but I understand the reality of needing a community of people who understand what one has been through. They built that for each other.
Selma, a film by Ava DuVernay about the historic struggle to secure voting rights for African Americans led by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is available for streaming. Do an online search. Also, check your local library.
Revolution to Rights, America at 250 returns in April with a conversation about the 2020 series, Mrs. America, and the women's movement of the 1970s that became a battle for women's rights and family values.
Has this podcast made you more curious about American history, freedom movements, and visiting sites where history comes alive? Sign up for our Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters newsletter to receive Revolution to Rights America at 250 resources to engage, reflect, and be the first to know about in-person and virtual meetups with the Boston Sisters.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your favorite podcast platform to be notified about the Revolution to Rights series and more podcasts spotlighting recent historical dramas.
Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.